Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your entire life savings had vanished overnight. Your government tells you that your pension will be cut in half. Your children cannot find jobs even after years of searching. This nightmare became reality for millions of Europeans when a storm that started on Wall Street crossed the Atlantic Ocean and tore apart the very fabric of European society. What followed was not just an economic disaster, but a human tragedy that would reshape an entire continent for more than a decade, and still echoes today in the hearts of those who lived through it. The storm arrives from across the ocean. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, most Europeans thought they were watching an American problem unfold on television screens thousands of miles away. The images of bankers carrying boxes out of New York office buildings seemed distant and disconnected from daily life in Paris, Berlin, or Athens. But beneath the surface, European banks had become deeply tangled in the same dangerous web of risky investments that destroyed the American financial system. European financial institutions had purchased billions of dollars worth of American mortgage-backed securities, those complicated financial products that turned out to be worthless when the housing bubble burst. Banks in London, Frankfurt, and Dublin had been playing the same dangerous games as their American counterparts, lending money recklessly and making bets they could never afford to lose. The European Central Bank quickly realized that disaster was spreading like wildfire across the continent. Within days of Lehman's collapse, the ECB pumped 95 million euros into banking markets to try to stop the bleeding, then added another 108 billion euros in the following days. The money flowed like water from a broken dam, but it could not stop what was coming. European stock markets crashed as investors panicked and sold everything they owned. Companies that seemed strong and stable for decades suddenly could not get loans to pay their workers or buy supplies. Factories began closing their doors. Construction projects stopped halfway through completion, leaving empty buildings standing like skeletons against the sky. The unemployment lines grew longer each week as more and more people lost their jobs. What started as a banking problem quickly became a crisis that touched every person on the continent. Iceland falls first and falls hard. While larger European nations were still trying to understand what was happening, a small island nation in the North Atlantic became the first complete casualty of the crisis. Iceland had transformed itself from a quiet fishing nation into a banking powerhouse during the early 2000s. The country's three major banks grew so enormous that their assets became 10 times larger than Iceland's entire economy. These banks borrowed massive amounts of money from around the world and invested it in risky ventures, creating wealth and prosperity that seemed endless. Icelandic citizens enjoyed one of the highest standards of living on Earth. They bought expensive cars, traveled the world, and felt like they had discovered the secret to unlimited wealth. But the whole system was built on borrowed money and dangerous bets that could never be sustained. When the global financial crisis hit in October 2008, Iceland's banking system did not just stumble or struggle, it completely collapsed within a single week. All three major banks failed almost simultaneously, taking 90% of the country's banking system down with them. The Icelandic currency, the krona, lost more than half its value almost overnight, making everything imported incredibly expensive. Families who had taken out loans in foreign currencies suddenly owed twice as much money as before. People who thought they were middle class found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The psychological impact was devastating because Iceland is a small nation where everyone knows everyone else, and the sense of collective trauma ran deep through every family and community. Protests erupted in the streets of Reykjavik as angry citizens banged pots and pans outside government buildings, demanding accountability from the leaders who had allowed this catastrophe to happen. The government fell, and Iceland had to beg the International Monetary Fund for a bailout, something that felt humiliating for a proud nation that had always taken care of itself. Greece reveals its hidden disaster. While Iceland's collapse shocked the world because of its speed and completeness, Greece's crisis unfolded more slowly but cut even deeper into the heart of Europe. In late 2009, a newly elected Greek government made a confession that sent shockwaves through the European Union. The previous government had been lying about the country's finances for years, hiding the true size of Greece's budget deficit and national debt. The real numbers were catastrophic. Greece's deficit was not the 3% of GDP that European rules allowed, but actually more than 12%. The country's total debt stood at 113% of GDP, far higher than anyone had known. Greece had been living beyond its means for years, borrowing enormous sums to pay for government salaries, pensions, and social programs while collecting far too little in taxes. When the truth came out, international investors panicked and refused to lend Greece any more money. Without new loans, the Greek government could not pay its bills or make payments on its existing debts. The country faced the terrifying possibility of defaulting on its sovereign debt, which would mean admitting it could not pay back the money it owed to banks and investors around the world. This was not just a Greek problem anymore, because banks across Europe held billions of euros in Greek government bonds that might become worthless. The crisis threatened to spread like a disease from one country to another, potentially destroying the entire Eurozone. The European Union and International Monetary Fund scrambled to create the first ever bailout for a Eurozone member country, approving 110 billion euros in emergency loans in May 2010. But this money came with brutal conditions attached. Greece had to implement strict austerity measures that would cut government spending, reduce pensions, increase taxes, and eliminate thousands of public sector jobs. The dominoes was beginning to fall. The Greek crisis opened the floodgates and revealed that several other European nations faced similar problems. Ireland, which had been called the Celtic Tiger for its amazing economic growth, suddenly crashed harder than almost anyone expected. Irish banks had made enormous loans to property developers during a massive real estate bubble, and when that bubble burst, the banks faced catastrophic losses. The Irish government made a fateful decision to guarantee all the debts of its major banks, thinking this would restore confidence and stop the panic. Instead, this decision transferred the private debts of reckless banks onto the shoulders of Irish taxpayers, multiplying the government's debt by several times in a single moment. Ireland's debt exploded from 25% of GDP to over 100% almost overnight. By November 2010, Ireland had no choice but to accept an €85 billion bailout from the European Union and IMF, with all the painful conditions that came with it. Portugal followed 6 months later in May 2011, requesting €78 billion in rescue funds when it could no longer afford to borrow money at reasonable interest rates. Spain, with an economy much larger than Greece, Ireland, and Portugal combined, teetered on the edge of disaster as its banking system struggled with bad loans from its own housing bubble collapse. Cyprus, a tiny island nation in the Mediterranean, would later need its own bailout in 2012. The pattern became grimly familiar across these nations. Governments had either borrowed too much money themselves, taken on the debts of failing banks, or both. Now they faced a terrible choice: accept brutal bailout conditions or face complete economic collapse. The bailouts kept these countries from defaulting on their debts, but the price was enormous suffering for ordinary people who had nothing to do with creating the crisis. Austerity cuts. Deep into people's lives. The bailout programs came with a poison pill called austerity, a set of policies designed to reduce government spending and increase revenue at any cost. In country after country, governments slashed spending on everything from healthcare to education to social services. Public sector workers saw their salaries cut by 20 or 30% almost overnight. Pensions that people had worked their entire lives to earn were reduced dramatically, leaving elderly citizens struggling to afford food and medicine. Governments increased taxes on everything imaginable while simultaneously cutting the services those taxes had paid for. In Greece, the impact was catastrophic beyond measure. The Greek economy shrank by more than 25% over several years, a contraction worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies like bandages and medicine. Schools could not afford textbooks or heating in winter. Public transportation systems reduced service while increasing fares. The suicide rate increased dramatically as people lost hope and saw no way out of their desperate situations. Families that had been comfortable middle class found themselves unable to pay for electricity or afford meat more than once a week. Elderly people fainted in the streets from hunger because their pensions had been cut so severely. In Spain and Portugal, similar scenes played out as unemployment soared and government services disappeared. Ireland implemented severe cuts to public sector pay and eliminated many government programs that people had depended upon for decades. The human cost of austerity cannot be measured only in economic statistics, because it also meant broken dreams, destroyed families, and lost generations of young people. Youth left behind without hope. Perhaps the cruelest impact of the crisis fell upon young people who had committed no sin except being born at the wrong time. Youth unemployment reached levels that seemed impossible to believe in modern developed countries. In Greece and Spain, more than half of all young people under 25 could not find jobs by 2012 and 2013. More than 50% unemployment for an entire generation meant that millions of educated, capable young adults had no way to start their lives, build careers, or become independent from their parents. In Italy, youth unemployment exceeded 40%. Even in countries that handled the crisis better, young people faced unemployment rates of 20 or 30%. University graduates with degrees in engineering, medicine, law, and business could not find work in their fields and ended up competing for minimum wage jobs in restaurants and shops, if they could find work at all. Many young people continued living with their parents well into their 30s, not by choice, but because they had no income to move out and start their own families. The psychological damage cut deep as an entire generation felt abandoned by the society they had been raised to believe in. Young people watched their parents' pensions get cut while being told there would be nothing left for their own retirements. They saw their countries implementing policies that protected older generations' interests while sacrificing the young on the altar of debt repayment. Some young people became activists and protesters, filling the streets of Madrid, Athens, Lisbon, and other cities to demand change and voice their anger at the injustice. Others became depressed and hopeless, giving up on the dream of a better future. Hundreds of thousands of young people fled their home countries entirely, migrating to Germany, the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, or even leaving Europe altogether to find opportunities their own nations could no longer provide. This brain drain robbed struggling countries of their best and brightest, the very people they needed most to rebuild their societies. Society, fractures, and politics. Transform. The economic crisis did not just destroy jobs and savings, it shattered the social contract between citizens and their governments and transformed the political landscape of Europe forever. People who had trusted their leaders to manage the economy responsibly felt betrayed when they learned that politicians had lied about deficits, enabled bank corruption, or simply been incompetent. The massive protests that began in Greece and Iceland spread across the continent. In Spain, the Indignados movement saw hundreds of thousands of people occupy public squares in cities across the country, staying for weeks and months to demand real democracy and economic justice. In Greece, riots broke out regularly as people fought with police outside the parliament building, while lawmakers voted for new austerity measures inside. The traditional political parties that had governed European countries for decades began to crumble as voters abandoned them in disgust. New political movements emerged on both the far left and far right, promising radical solutions to the crisis and channeling popular anger into political action. Some of these movements offered hope for real change and greater democracy. Others promoted dangerous nationalism, blamed immigrants and minorities for economic problems, and threatened the unity of the European Union itself. Trust between European nations fractured as wealthier northern countries like Germany insisted on strict austerity conditions for bailouts, while southern countries accused them of cruelty and lack of solidarity. The European dream of unity and cooperation faced its greatest test since World War II. Inside families, the crisis caused terrible stress and division. Parents felt ashamed that they could not provide for their children. Adult children moved back home with their aging parents, creating tension and resentment on all sides. Divorce rates increased as financial pressure destroyed marriages. Mental health problems soared as people struggled with anxiety, depression, and feelings of hopelessness. The fabric of civil society frayed as people became more focused on individual survival and less able to maintain the community bonds that had always held European societies together. The struggle for solutions and reform. As the crisis dragged on year after painful year, European leaders struggled to find solutions that could stop the bleeding and prevent future disasters. The European Union created new institutions and mechanisms designed to provide stability and prevent contagion. In 2012, the European Stability Mechanism was established as a permanent rescue fund with the ability to provide financial assistance to Eurozone countries in trouble. This created a firewall of sorts, giving the EU tools to respond quickly to future crises without having to negotiate entirely new bailout agreements each time. The European Central Bank, led by Mario Draghi, eventually took dramatic action by pledging to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro currency. This commitment, backed by unprecedented monetary policy measures, including massive bond-buying programs, helped restore confidence in European financial markets and brought down the crushing interest rates that had been strangling countries like Spain and Italy. Banking regulations were strengthened across the EU to prevent the kind of reckless lending and risky investments that had helped trigger the crisis. Stress tests were implemented to ensure banks could survive future economic shocks without collapsing. But these reforms came too late for the millions who had already lost everything. The debate over austerity versus economic stimulus raged among economists and politicians. Some argued that austerity was necessary medicine, painful but required to restore confidence and bring government budgets back into balance. Others insisted that cutting spending during a severe recession was economic madness that made the crisis worse by destroying demand and prolonging the suffering. The evidence increasingly suggested that harsh austerity had been a mistake that deepened and lengthened the crisis. But this realization came too late to change the policies that had already been implemented. Countries recovered at vastly different speeds depending on their specific circumstances and policy choices. Ireland eventually returned to growth and regained access to financial markets, though at enormous human cost. Spain's economy began to stabilize after several brutal years. Greece remained trapped in crisis for most of the decade, experiencing a depression that destroyed a quarter of its economic output and left scars that would take generations to fully heal. The long shadow and lasting scars. Even as economic statistics slowly improved in the mid to late 2010s, the crisis left deep scars across European society that remain visible today. An entire generation of young people, sometimes called the lost generation, saw their career trajectories permanently altered. Young adults who could not find jobs during the critical years after finishing their education suffered from reduced lifetime earnings and career advancement compared to those who graduated before or after the crisis. The skills they could not develop and the experience they could not gain during those lost years could never be fully recovered. Many people who lost their homes during the crisis never regained the same level of financial security. Families that had been forced to sell properties at fire sale prices or had been evicted for inability to pay mortgages watched as the same properties later increased in value, but the wealth went to new owners while the original families remained poor. Retirement security was permanently damaged for millions as pension cuts meant people who had worked their entire lives now faced old age with far less support than they had planned for and been promised. The crisis accelerated inequality across Europe as wealthy people who owned financial assets benefited from rising stock and bond markets, while working people saw wages stagnate or fall and public services decline. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically, creating societies that were more divided and less cohesive than they had been before the crisis. Trust in institutions remained damaged long after the worst of the crisis had passed. Many citizens never regained faith in banks, governments, or the European Union itself. This loss of trust created fertile ground for populist political movements that continued to gain strength throughout the 2010s, leading to events like Brexit and the rise of anti-EU parties across the continent. The crisis also revealed fundamental flaws in how the Eurozone was designed. Countries that shared a common currency could not respond to economic shocks by adjusting their exchange rates, leaving them with austerity as virtually the only policy tool available. This structural problem was partially addressed through reforms, but was never fully solved, leaving the Eurozone vulnerable to future crises. Lessons learned in blood and tears. The story of how the 2008 financial crisis affected Europe is ultimately a story of human suffering caused by human choices. The crisis was not a natural disaster like an earthquake or hurricane. It was created by human decisions, bankers who pursued profits without considering risk, politicians who hid the truth and avoided difficult choices, regulators who failed to enforce rules, and a financial system that rewarded short-term gains over long-term stability. The catastrophe that followed was made worse by policy choices that prioritized protecting bondholders and enforcing austerity over protecting people and preserving social cohesion. The crisis revealed that financial systems are not abstract mechanisms but human creations that can fail catastrophically when designed poorly or regulated weakly. It showed that the costs of financial failure fall not on those who created the crisis, but on ordinary people who lose their jobs, homes, and futures. It demonstrated that in times of crisis, the weakest and most vulnerable members of society suffer the most, while the powerful and wealthy often escape relatively unscathed. Europe learned painful lessons about the importance of banking regulation, the dangers of excessive debt, and the need for economic policy coordination across nations sharing a common currency. The crisis prompted reforms that made the European financial system more resilient and created mechanisms for responding to future crises more effectively. But whether these reforms are sufficient to prevent the next crisis remains an open question. The crisis also taught lessons that many leaders seemed determined not to learn. It showed the terrible human cost of austerity policies that cut too deep and too fast, yet similar policies continue to be implemented. It revealed the dangers of inequality and the importance of inclusive economic growth, yet inequality continued to increase in many countries, even after the crisis supposedly ended. Perhaps the most important lesson is that economies exist to serve people, not the other way around. When economic policies cause mass unemployment, poverty, and hopelessness, those policies have failed regardless of what technical economic indicators might suggest. An economy that leaves an entire generation without jobs or hope is not functioning properly, no matter what the budget deficit statistics show. A continent forever changed. The 2008 financial crisis did not just affect Europe for a few difficult years. It fundamentally transformed the continent's economy, politics, and society in ways that continue to shape European life today. Millions of people saw their dreams destroyed and their faith in the future shattered. An entire generation came of age during a time of hopelessness and unemployment that marked them forever. Political systems that had seemed stable for decades were shaken to their foundations, with consequences that include Brexit and the rise of populist movements and ongoing threats to European unity. The crisis revealed that the grand European project of economic integration and shared currency was built on a foundation with dangerous cracks that had been papered over rather than properly fixed. It showed that prosperity can disappear far more quickly than it can be built, and that the journey from economic security to poverty can happen almost overnight when financial systems fail. The human cost cannot be calculated only in economic statistics about GDP decline or unemployment rates. It must be measured in broken families, lost opportunities, abandoned dreams, and psychological trauma that shaped an entire generation. It must be measured in the lives that were ended by suicide when the pressure became too great, in the relationships that fractured under financial stress, and in the children who grew up in poverty because their parents lost everything through no fault of their own. Yet the story is not entirely one of darkness and despair. People also demonstrated remarkable resilience and solidarity in the face of catastrophe. Families supported each other through impossible hardships. Communities organized to provide food and services when governments could no longer do so. Young people who could not find jobs created their own opportunities through entrepreneurship and innovation. Countries eventually recovered, though at enormous cost and with deep scars that remain. The crisis of 2008 stands as a warning to future generations about the dangers of financial excess, the importance of proper regulation, and the terrible human cost of policy choices that prioritize abstract economic principles over human well-being. It reminds us that economic systems are not natural forces beyond human control, but human creations that can be changed, reformed, and rebuilt to better serve the needs of all people. The test of whether Europe truly learned from this catastrophe will be whether it allows something similar to happen again. The institutions and regulations created in response to the crisis provide some protection, but they are only as strong as the political will to maintain and enforce them. The memory of the crisis fades a little more each year, especially for those who did not live through it, and with that fading memory comes the danger of repeating the same mistakes. For those who lived through the worst of the crisis, who lost their homes, their jobs, their savings, and their hope, the memory will never fade. They carry the scars forever, a reminder of how quickly security can turn to catastrophe and how important it is to build economic systems that protect people rather than sacrifice them.